Hello, and welcome to our THF Conversation Spotlight series, where we celebrate social innovators, industry experts, and trailblazers. Today, March 31st, is Cesar Chavez Day, a U.S. federal commemorative holiday celebrating the birth and legacy of this incredible civil rights leader and labor movement activist. I'm Cynthia Jones, Director of Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, and I'm honored today to speak with Paul Chavez, the president of the Cesar Chavez Foundation. Paul, thank you, welcome. I look so forward to kind of thinking about your father's history and impact, but also really digging into your career and how you're taking the movement forward. Welcome.
First off, Cynthia, thank you very much for being part of your program, and we're excited to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you so much. As we get started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do at the Cesar Chavez Foundation?
Well, I'm one of the 8 children of Cesar and Helen Chavez. I'm actually, we used to joke, and I would tell people that I was number 6 on the family seniority list. But we grew up in the farm worker movement, and it was really the only life that we knew. But I've done throughout the years, I've done different things, but most recently I'm overseeing the Cesar Chavez Foundation, which is the arm of the farm worker movement that addresses the needs that working people have in the community. It's a social enterprise, and we provide affordable housing to families across 5 states in the Southwest. We have Spanish language radio stations and English stations that talk to recent immigrants and their children about the issues that affect them, and give them ways to get involved in solving their problems. We have launched an educational initiative program that looks to minimize and to shrink that educational gap that exists with so many kids of color. And then we have the work of the National Chavez Center that looks to promote and protect my father's legacy and to ensure that it remains relevant in today's discussions.
Wow, so from the list of all the work that you and the foundation and your groups have going on, I would say that that legacy is clear, and that the impact and ongoing work is super clear in what you just listed out there. So thinking about your childhood, growing up with such amazing folks in your family, I'm imagining that you might have participated in a march or a boycott with your father, with your mom and dad. Could you tell us about that? Do you have a fond memory of that?
Well, what I do recall is that from an early age, we realized that things were a little bit different in our household. My dad was on the road a lot, building the union, talking to people and inspiring them. And so there was many baseball games that he didn't attend, and there was birthdays that he missed. And so, growing up, it's hard to understand why your dad's not around. But we learned at a pretty early age that we were going to have to share them with other people, because there was people that came from all over. And so in learning to share them with other people, we began to experience a lot of things that we're privileged to experience. We met people that were newsmakers and that were innovators for their times. But I always remind people that growing up, he didn't go to the baseball games in the parks, like I mentioned, but we went to a lot of picket lines, and we were on a lot of strikes and boycotts and unions conventions. And so my dad, he was smart in the sense that he made sure that his work was big enough to include his family. And so while we didn't spend that traditional time with my dad in those kind of settings, we were with him a lot in those other parts of his work.
Wow. I love that. And it makes me wonder, so I know you went on in your own right to get degrees in negotiation, and you've done a lot of work as a lobbyist, as a political director. You've really moved the movement forward. When did you know you might want to engage in work that would make life better for the community around you?
I think it came down to a trip that I took with my mother. I'd grown up around the movement, and that's all we did. And at one point, I thought I wanted to go to college and become an attorney and come back and work in the legal department of the union. But it was really at the urging of our general counsel who suggested that I work with my father and understand the workings of the organization and learn about the different programmatic side that, he thought that that's where I could make a bigger contribution. And so at that point, I thought that maybe that I would go that route. But the the incident that comes to mind where I sat there and I made a decision that I needed to do something was a trip that I took with my mother. My grandfather, my grandpa Pete, was a big, strong, powerful man. And I remember he would come to the Central Valley following the crops every summer. And, he was just this big man, and kids would line up, all the grandkids would line up and would sit on Grandpa Pete's lap, and he would give us $1 to go get an ice cream. And we thought he was the strongest and richest man that we'd ever seen. And then, many years later, my mother got a call that he had passed away in a little town on the California-Arizona border. And so I went with my mother and my brother and my uncles to bury him and to take care of, of all of the arrangements. And I remember getting to where he lived, and it was nothing, it was this little shack, and he had nothing. And all I could think of was that here was this man that has spent his entire life, the most productive years of his life, making somebody very wealthy, and he had nothing to show for it. And so I remember becoming indignant. But then as we went through his things, we opened up this little cigar case that he had, where he kept his valuables. And I saw his UFW pin, and I saw a leaflet that was folded up talking about my dad coming to Blythe, the little town on the border there, where he was going to talk to workers about organizing. And I sat there and I realized that he understood that the hope for many farm workers, not just him, but for many farm workers, was that this union would succeed. And it was at that point that I decided that this was something very personal to me and that I had to do my part.
Thank you. We can hear the emotion in your voice when you reflect on that. And, thank you for sharing that very personal story. I think so often when we think about leaders or leadership, we tend to think that there's been big decisions or big moments where you've decided to step into leadership. And I think we forget that oftentimes it happens in a very personal way like that it happens from an experience and from seeing it. So thank you so much for bringing that forward.
Well, Cynthia, and if I can interject, I remember being with my father later on during, as we worked together, and he was asked by a TV crew, Cesar, you've been at this for 4 decades now, and it appears that passion burns as bright as always. And what is that? What is that ideology? What is that ideology that drives you? And he looked at the person and he says, it's not any fancy ideology. He says, it's that look in my mother's eyes when she told me that I couldn't go to school anymore, that I needed to work to help feed my brothers and sisters. It was that look in that eye that got me angry, and that helped me decide that one day I had to do something about this. And so I think many times, the ideologies can help us articulate visions, but there's nothing like that personal motivation of being angry about injustice. And I know that's something that drove my father, and it's what I also experienced. It's very powerful.
It is very powerful. And I think having that sort of the fire in the belly and seeing into the eyes of people around you that is certainly something that as we have studied people in the civil rights movement, across many, many communities, that has been the driving force. Mm-hmm. And so often as we've done that studying, looking back at, our country's history and those trailblazers, we've kind of identified some key habits or actions that are consistent. And I think you just mentioned one of them without calling it this, but that when you look into those eyes of the people around you, that you decide to collaborate with them, to create power together. Can you think about an example of kind of how that habit of innovation, that collaboration might have helped you in the movement, in your work?
Well, the concept of collaboration is something that's been central to our work. Before my father began organizing the union, he had looked at past attempts to organize farm workers. For 100 years before him, all attempts had been crudely crushed, and they were not able to build a union. And these were people that had the support of larger organizations and people with a lot more education than our founders. But one thing that they did learn was that the employers in agriculture were pretty adept at pitting one group against another. If Filipino farm workers went on strike, Mexicans were brought in to break their strikes. If Mexicans went on strike, they would bring in African Americans to break their strikes. And so they were pretty adept at pitting groups that had tremendous economic needs against one another. And so at the very beginning, they knew that it was going to have to be a collaboration of different ethnic groups that were working in the fields to have any, in order to have any chance at success. And so that initial grape strike in 1965 was the first time in the history of agriculture that Filipino farm workers and Mexican farm workers and African American farm workers joined together in a 5-year-long grape strike that eventually brought better wages and protections for thousands of farm workers in the grape industry. But it was really that whole notion that we had to work together that brought that success and really established the first enduring union for farm workers. Other parts of that collaborative spirit was that my father knew that we weren't big enough to win this thing by ourselves, that we were going to have to work with other people. And so a big part of his job was going out and talking to people, asking for their support, but also understanding that we had an obligation to help people where we could. And so, if you take a look at the boycotts of the 70s and 80s and 90s, we would go out and we would talk to housewives in the Midwest that maybe knew nothing about a farm worker and had never set foot on a farm. But when they heard about the injustice that was happening on the fields, they joined us and they voted with their pocketbook, and they refused to buy grapes and lettuce. And so, I think that whole spirit of collaboration and turning to others and really recognizing that you're never really strong enough to do this by yourself is something that has influenced our work from day one.
Powerful examples. Thank you. And you actually mentioned something in there that I'll call out that we also emphasize, empathy. So empathy and understanding the impact on those around you is something we see as behind social change and social innovation. And I love how you mentioned kind of the housewives, and they may not have understood what was happening in the fields until the movement was talking to them and helping open eyes. So,
well, in this work, you got to have tremendous faith in the goodness of people, that you can appeal to their higher sense of morality and that people will respond. My father was the eternal optimist. He just believed that if you talk to people and you let them know your plight, that good people would respond in turn, and his life was filled with that. He actually suffered more setbacks than victories, yet he was never deterred, and his faith in the goodness of humanity and the American consuming public was never diminished. And I think that was another reason why his legacy continues to inspire people. He was that internal optimist that believed that at the end of the day, that people are basically good.
I can connect that to so many innovators over time. I thank you for pulling that out. So one of our other pieces about innovation that we've studied is that oftentimes you have to optimize. So your strategies are moving along, but you need to improve them and change them over time. So I know many of the goals of the organization went beyond the basics of working conditions. They went into housing, they went into education. Many of the things that the foundation continues to move forward today. How does optimization in your strategy, what does that look like for you today?
Well, it's one of the founding principles of our movement. In that research that my father conducted before he organized farm workers, he looked at past attempts to organize, and he knew that things would have to be done differently, that we would have to take the fights out of rural areas into the cities. And he understood that we would have to, put our movement on a higher moral plane. And so that meant that we would have to refrain from violence, and we'd have to teach people to turn the other cheek when violence was committed. And he understood that from a nonviolent tactic that was very powerful, but he also believed that nobody, for whatever reason, has a right to commit injury against another person. And so that was an important founding principle. But the one that comes to mind is that they had this idea that workers just aren't workers. After a long, hard day's work in the fields or in a factory, that workers go home to a whole different set of problems. The lack of access to high quality and affordable health care, educational opportunities for our children, access to high quality health care, access to consumer credit. And so they knew that because of the poverty that our community faced, that it would take more than a union, it would take a movement to address the needs at the workplace, but in the community. And so that was one of the founding principles. I remind people that years before the first organizing campaign and strike, they were providing a death benefit to bury people with dignity. They had cooperative gas stations, and they started clinics and daycare centers and a credit union to offer those tremendous needs that people have outside the workplace. And so I think that's one way that we've optimized it, is that we understand that a worker just isn't a worker, that they're parents and consumers that go home to a whole different set of problems. And that's the work that we've continued to focus on in the Cesar Chavez Foundation.
I think that's beautiful, kind of understanding the dignity of the whole person and thinking about, life is more than just the thing you do during the day, but it is the life that you live.
Right. And, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the big proponents of this was from Detroit, was Walter Reuther, who was the legendary president of the United Farm Workers. He was the first major labor official to come and support the farm workers, but he also had this idea that labor needed to be active in their communities. And so it was at his insistence and the assistance of Senator Bobby Kennedy that the predecessor of the Cesar Chavez Foundation was formed in 1966 to address those needs of workers outside the workplace.
That's a wonderful nugget of history. Thank you for working it in there. I think, certainly here in the Metro Detroit area, we're very attuned to labor history, especially in the auto industry. But I think it's so important to understand that crosses over many, many industries. So thank you for pulling that one forward. So I know that a lot of your work is focused on kind of the next generation, passing along the legacy as you've been sharing today, but to inspire that next generation. Is there a value or a quote that you share that you find most resonates with youth today?
Well, we have this idea that the power of my father's legacy wasn't measured by great speeches that he gave, even though he gave some pretty powerful talks. It was through his presence. I'd mentioned that for many years, attempts to organize farm workers had been brutally beaten, and so when my dad began his work, people would look at him and they would say, like, well, why do you think you can make a difference? And he would talk about the need to go out and do that work. But one of the things that I've heard people tell me many times about the first time meeting my father, that they were expecting to go out and meet this man 6'2" with this booming voice that would make speeches that would shake the rafters. And what they found was they found a small, dark man with strong indigenous features who was kind of shy, didn't use big fancy words, but when he began to speak, he spoke about those ideals and hopes that we all have for the future. And as he spoke, I think people looked at him and they saw their own fathers in him and their uncles and next door neighbors. And they saw that he didn't come from a family that could give him a silver spoon, right? And so when they saw his example and they saw him talk about these things that we all long for, they began to say, if Cesar Chavez can make a difference, maybe I can make a difference. And it was through his example that he inspired people to believe that they have a lot to offer. and that they have self-worth. And so I think that that was a big part of his appeal. But I gotta believe that at the end of his 1968 fast for nonviolence, it was a time where things weren't going well, and some of the younger strikers were talking about maybe we need to go and burn some packing sheds and bust some heads, and maybe they'll listen to us. That my father felt that he had failed as a leader to teach people the importance of nonviolence. And it was at that end of that fast for nonviolence, where the movement recommitted itself to nonviolence, that he talked about this whole concept of service. And he said that it was his deepest belief that only by giving our lives do you find true life. And so it was a call to service that was sent out to everybody. And the fact of the matter is, it's a call that everybody can respond to if they so choose to do. And we've always talked to people, and we've made sure that they understand that we don't put my father on a pedestal, that he wasn't so much different than they are. Same type of backgrounds and economic circumstances, yet he showed us that if you work hard and you're committed and you never ever give up, you can make a difference. And so those are some of the lessons that we share with people. But I think it was that call of being a service to others is something that resonates with people, especially in today's world where things are kind of difficult and sometimes despair can set in. I think that if you remind people that we can all be of service, I think it inspires folks.
That's fantastic. And I think it leads directly to my next question for you. So I've looked at your career, I've looked at obviously your father's leadership, your mom's influence. You've committed your life to that life of service, to being a community leader, to advocating. So for folks out there, maybe young people out there who are interested in doing that with their life, what's a piece of advice that you would share?
I remember, the work that we do is difficult, and things don't always go as planned, and actually more often than not, they don't. But the thing is that you need to continue to pick yourselves up when things don't go well, and you need to stick with it. It's that whole idea of persistence and that dogged determination that makes a difference. I learned that lesson directly from my father. I was earlier in my career, I was the union's lobbyist, and we had this big all-out push in the state capital of California to confirm a gubernatorial appointee to the Farm Labor Board. It was the first act in the country, the United States, and the only act that gives farm workers, well, it was the first act in the United States to give farm workers the right to bargain collectively. The outgoing governor was relatively sympathetic, and the incoming administration was they weren't a friend of ours. And so we knew that we were in for hard times. And so we pushed hard to get this last minute confirmation done. And so we had to get 21 votes in the state Senate. And I remember we probably had 400 organizers working from the Mexican to the Oregon border, talking to every senator, trying to get 21 votes. And I remember after about a 4-week campaign, the last day of the legislative session, it was upon us, and I was in the Senate gallery with my dad and about 300 farm workers that had come from all over state to watch this vote that we knew was going to be so important. And the vote came up around 8:00 at night, and we got to 18, 19, 20, and it stuck at 20. And they pulled the gavel down. We were 1 vote short, and I was devastated. Because I knew what was going to happen. And it was about 10:00 by the time my father finished seeing off workers and thanking them and urging them to keep the faith, that he turns to me and he says, "Why don't we drive home?" And I said, "Sure." And now home is 5 hours from the state capitol, but I wasn't going to sleep. I felt terrible. And so we jumped in the car and we started driving. He didn't say anything for an hour, but he could see that I was feeling bad. And he asked me, how do you feel? I said, "I feel terrible, Dad. I feel like I let you down. I let the farm workers down. I let the movement down. I just feel terrible." And he says, "Well, did you work as hard as you could work?" And I said, "Dad, I've never worked harder than I did this last 4 weeks. well, did you leave any stones unturned? I said, I did everything I could think of. I just can't think of anything else. And then he says, well, and these words, they just, they, they sound like they just, like he just said them yesterday. He says, you got to remember, mijo, son, you got to remember that in our work, it's not like a baseball game where after 9 innings, whoever has the most runs wins and the other loses. It's not a political campaign or an election day, whoever gets the most votes wins and the other loses. In our work, the work of La Causa, the work of fighting for social justice, you only lose when you give up. And then he says, let's go home and get some rest because tomorrow we have a lot of work to do. And so it was that spirit of knowing that, that things aren't always going to go well, but when you get knocked down, what do? You get up and you dust your pants off and you go at it some more. And I think that's a message that we share with people, is that you got to have that persistence, right? Whether you're organizing farm workers or you're trying to make change in your neighborhoods, or if you're trying to get ahead in your career, you just got to have that persistence and never give up, because at the end of the day, there is nothing stronger than determination and hope.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm inspired and I'm ready to dust off the pants and stay persistent here in the fight for social justice, for workers' rights, for, truly shared just experience across our culture and our country. So Paul, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your family's history. And we so appreciate you.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you all very much.
And as we close out, I just wanted to reflect on one of my favorite quotes. I think I actually learned a few more today, but one of my favorite Cesar Chavez quotes has been that once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. And you can't uneducate a person who's learned to read. You cannot humiliate a person who feels pride. And you cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. So that has always been one of my favorite pieces, because I think it speaks to social change, getting into the hearts and our souls, right, and what it does for our own empowerment. So thank you so much for all of you who joined us today, celebrating on this special day. We appreciate you. To learn more about Paul's work and the work of the Cesar Chavez Foundation, you can find them at the chavezfoundation.org. And we invite you to visit us here in the Detroit area in Dearborn, Michigan at the Henry Ford, or to visit us online at thehenryford.org to learn about other leaders, innovators, inventors, change makers who inspire us every day to stay persistent. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.